Oppressors in their turn, the French Revolution and the English Romantics. And really we're focusing, as I indicated, more on Wordsworth and the other Romantics, but Wordsworth is in some ways emblematic of some of the other Romantics. We'll get a chance to talk about the Romantics a little bit, Wordsworth in particular. I want to begin with a quote from, well, you'll see. A tyrant, whether by wrong or by right coming to the crown, is he who, regarding neither law nor the common good, reigns only for himself and his faction. It is lawful, and hath been held so through the ages, for any who has the power to call to account a tyrant or wicked king, and after due conviction to depose and put him to death. This is John Milton in the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, 1649. I believe that's the year that Charles I of England was tried and executed by the English, and this led to a brief problematic stretch for the monarchy. It later came back, but this was a significant historical event in the history of the battle over and against monarchy. We're going to start back in the Middle Ages to understand a little bit about the French Revolution. We have to go all the way back to the Middle Ages. This is one of the reasons why this gets so complex. These are three of the characters in our drama. These are what are known as the three estates. In French, I think it's ordre, the orders. We have the clergy, the first estate, the nobility, the second estate, and the third estate, which included really everyone else. And these are basically the social strata of the Middle Ages, and not just the Middle Ages, but also afterwards. And these three characters, these three social strata, these three political forces come to be especially important in the French Revolution. And we're going to talk a little bit about how the fortunes of these three estates over the intervening time. So in 1378, there was what was known as the Western Schism in Europe, and that's where you had two different people claiming to be Pope, and later on there was a third one, I believe. And this, as you can imagine, led to some problems within the church at the time. And the aftermath of it really caused problems for the influence and the reputation of the church. Thus did the first estate, the clergy, lose some of its power and influence, and that's why I put an X there. Next, the 100 Years' War. We're going pretty quick through history. This was between the French and the English, and it was really a battle over French sovereignty, whether the French could maintain control of France. It stretched over the course of about 100 years, as you can see. Shook things up quite a bit. The aftermath, however, is that the second estate, the nobility, who really, they were the ones who raised the armies, who led the armies, all of that under a very feudal system, lost power, lost influence. So they're out of the running as well. So with the first estate kind of out of the mix in a sense, and the second estate also on the wane, what does that mean? What does that leave us? Do we have here the triumph of the third estate? We do not. We have the early modern period where monarchy comes to the fore. So we basically have a kind of power vacuum, or a lack of the influence. The first estate's on the wane, second estate's on the wane. Third estate doesn't really have any power or influence to speak of, never did. Political representation, nothing of that sort, really. So the figure lurking really behind or above these estates stepped in. And this picture that you see right here, this is very much a multimedia presentation. I've got lots and lots of paintings. They should be cool, I hope. Is from the frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. Hobbes, an Enlightenment thinker, was very much someone who subscribed to a really strong central state, the divine right of kings, basically absolute monarchy. And this is kind of what defines the early modern period, this stretch of 300 years actually, which is critical in lots of ways to understanding the French Revolution. So what happened in the early modern period? Centralization of taxation. The king and the kingdom took over this task. The centralization of law enforcement. So police officers, people doing that sort of thing became under the employment or the supervision of the state. Centralization of war making. Before, like for instance, during the 100 Years' War, you would have the nobility usually raising armies for the king. But it turned out, especially with the advent of things like the cannon, as we saw in that picture back there, that a standing army is much more effective, is much more efficient, we might say. And in fact, all of these things, these aspects of centralization we see going on in the early modern period, possible because of the power vacuum after the Western Schism and the 100 Years' War, is a tendency for centralization, is a tendency for efficiency in a lot of ways. This has its beginning here. And we're beginning to get into the Enlightenment where that becomes even more important. Into this situation, 1643 is crowned Louis XIV of France. He had the longest reign in European history of any European monarch at something like 72 years, something like that. These are just the dates that he reigned, not even the dates he was alive. He continued this process of centralization, this project of nation building, building up the state, centralizing power, taking over authority from these separate regions. And he ruled under two important principles: divine right of kings and what is called enlightened absolutism. So divine right of kings is obviously it's God who has put the monarch on the throne, and for that reason, really the king is beholden only to God, maybe to the Pope. But later on, for instance, the French Huguenots were Protestants and didn't bend the knee to the Pope. For them, only God was above the king. There was no questioning the king. Again, unless under certain circumstances you're the Pope. But for most people, no questioning of the king if divine right of kings was in force. And then enlightened absolutism, we don't usually think of the Enlightenment, which kind of gets underway about this time, as tending to, we think of it in terms of its effect on individuals, and it's been about individualism. But actually, a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers, especially the French ones, like the name slips my mind, Voltaire, I'm sorry. They were very strong monarchists, actually. And that's because monarchy, as really a way of centralizing power, granted efficient means to getting things done. And also the Enlightenment philosophers didn't always have a really high view of the common man. So enlightened absolutism was really where monarchy, absolute monarchy, and Enlightenment principles sort of met. And they both worked together to increase centralization of power, increase the power of kings. Louis XIV is famous for having said, "L'état c'est moi." I think that's how you pronounce that. I don't really have any French. It means, I am the state. I am the state. The state is the biggest thing, and I am that biggest thing. A couple other things about Louis XIV. We're going to have to move quickly, I realize. He also built Versailles, which is, before the king would typically reside in Paris. Versailles is just outside of Paris, which is in a sense kind of physically removing him from the jurisdiction of the people, just as divine right of kings, enlightened absolutism remove him kind of figuratively from the jurisdiction of the people. And also what he did at Versailles was gather together all of the nobles, which, again, centralization. He could supervise them, he could occupy them, and prevent them from working behind his back. Also, among his kind of centralization policies, he is also known for having suppressed freedom of religion quite a bit. So for instance, the Jansenists, who were a group of Catholics, you may have heard of Pascal, he was one of them. He cracked down on the Jansenists and basically outlawed Jansenism. He also cracked down on French Protestants, the Huguenots. So there was really one form of religion allowed in France under Louis XIV. So this was not a man who encouraged a lot of individual liberties. Despite that, he actually got along pretty well with the nobles, perhaps because he was wining and dining them at Versailles, but also because he allowed them to keep, at least in the beginning, some of their privileges. We'll talk about their privileges a little bit later. We're going to continue to move through this. The country of France expanded quite a bit under, well, especially Louis XIV. If you see all of these conquests under Louis XIV, but this doesn't look like much, but actually within 250 years, this is a great deal of territorial expansion. So major military operations underway. Now, he did face some backlash. The Fronde was a civil war in France where the nobility and some of the other people as well fought back because the king, Louis XIV, was trying to impose some new taxes on them. Taxes are critical in understanding what brought about the French Revolution. And anyway, they lost the war, and the king continued to centralize things. But this is the first instance in some ways of really active resistance. Later on, in the 1700s, we've moved forward a little bit in time. This is really after Louis XIV. There is what's known as the aristocratic resurgence. So the state continued to centralize, and the aristocrats don't like this. And they have courts of their own called parlement. We get our word parliament from them. And this is the one in Paris, for instance, and they actively opposed the kings, whether it was the Louis XIV or the 15th or later on the 16th, attempts to levy new taxes, for instance, attempts to reform things. They're really a continued force for the feudal system in some ways, mostly because they wanted to protect their privileges. And we can talk about those privileges really quickly. So if I'm a noble, I am exempt from some major taxes, land taxes, for instance. And not only am I exempt from certain taxes, but I am also entitled to basically collecting rent from the peasants who work my land. And so not only do I not have to pay taxes for the most part, but I also get more money without really having to do anything. I just have to kind of sit in my manor. This is called manorialism. It has to do with manners in the Middle Ages and there afterwards as well. So these are two problems that begin to come up for the monarchs. We have civil war, we have aristocratic resurgence. Next, we have the 7 Years' War. I'll tell you why this is a problem. 7 Years' War is again between France and Britain. And it was really a battle over their colonies. And one of these colonies, the most famous probably, was French Canada. So New France here in North America. And the French lost this war, and they lost it along with a whole bunch of money, This was a very expensive war that they lost. This created financial difficulties. More financial difficulties. The French supported the Americans in the Revolutionary War, the War for Independence. Here we have, you can see the French ships and the British ships attacking each other. So at great cost, actually, the French supported the Americans in the Revolutionary War, primarily out of revenge against the British, but also to weaken the British. And this didn't backfire. not in a straightforward sort of way, but it did cost an enormous amount of money. And together with the 7 Years' War and the Revolutionary War, we're short of cash here. So we've got problems with the nobles, we've got a cash shortage, we've got staggering national debt. Then along comes famine and bread riots. So flour war, we've got wars of all different kinds. 1775, we're very close to the French Revolution here. We're almost through our background on this. At about this time, not only was there famine, which you can't really do much about, you can't predict, but there was a lot of inflation, because at this time the monarchy's very centralized economic policy was laissez-faire, hands-off, kind of free market economics, and this caused inflation, and it was no longer possible for poor people to buy the food they needed, even when it was available. So I've heard things like, you know, a loaf of bread cost you a month's wages or something like that. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it was a major problem. And there were bread riots where people would basically assault the the places where the local towns and villages would keep the flour, for instance. And we'll see that later on the French Revolution, though we probably won't dwell much on the bread and flour after this. So more problems. And of course, this not only did we have a problem with the second estate, the nobility, now we have a problem with the third estate, the peasants, the bourgeoisie, the merchant class. Really everyone who was not in the clergy, the nobility, which is almost everyone, was part of this third estate. Now, into all this comes Louis XVI. What do we know about Louis? He took the throne at the age of 20. He was inexperienced, indecisive, and insecure. Some great quotes from him. One of them is, when he took the throne, "Oh God, guide us, protect us. We are too young to reign." And something like this is more understandable when you think about the situation he was inheriting with the throne. So we've got the strife with the nobles, we've got the financial predicament, and we've got the problems with the third estate, inflation, bread riots, famine, shortage, all of this stuff. And here we have an inexperienced, indecisive, insecure king. This does not bode well whatsoever. Now, the major problem at the outset of the French Revolution, we're very close. Most people date the French Revolution from 1789. Here we're in February of 87. The major problem besetting Louis the 16th was the debt, the national debt. This is something we had to take care of right away. Worst case scenario with the bread riots, you know, the third estate would suffer. We're not too worried right now about the grievances of the second estate, the nobility, but we do have to pay back our debts. So what Louis the 16th does is convene an assembly of notables, which is basically the parlement, the courts of the nobility, and he's trying to get them to accept some new taxes. And needless to say, they don't want to have to pay any new taxes. So they say, in order for a decision like that to be made, we need to appeal to the will of really the state, the nation. We need to call a meeting of the Estates General, which is what it's called. The Estates General had not convened since 1614, which is like 160 years earlier. So no one really knows what's going to happen when the Estates General is convened. Right here we have the third estate. You can see where they are relative to everyone else. We've got the king over there with this very nice crown. And I believe that's the first estate on his right hand and the second estate on his left. And the third estate is over here. Now, the topic at the Estates General very quickly changed from taxes to politics, to political structure and representation in particular. Now, you had the same number of representatives of each estate. So same number of clergy as nobility as third estate members. And each got, well, voting could take place in different ways. They decided to vote by order, which means that if you're a member of the third estate, you all get together, put your heads together, and let's say 51 of you vote one way and 49 of you vote the other. Those 51 will get your one vote for the third estate. The problem is, if you've got an alliance between the nobility, the clergy, and the nobility, the third estate's vote isn't really good for anything. And this seemed especially unjust, given that the third estate represented like 90% of the population, and they only had a third of the voting power. Obviously, this is not the way most people thought about it back then, but in retrospect, it's understandable. Anyway, the third estate feels like this. This is what they feel like. They feel like they're down here and they're carrying the rest of the French people. And you've got the clergyman here and the noble. They feel downtrodden, they feel beat upon, they feel like they're working really hard, and the others aren't doing their share of the work. So what they do is form their own national assembly to represent their interests. They come together, they realize that they have similar interests, and they create the National Assembly, as it's called. This is one of those places where, you know, it has this assembly has so many different names over the course of history and changes so many times it's hard to keep track of. So I'm probably just going to stick with the National Assembly name for it. Now, Louis XVI didn't really like this idea of their forming a governing body of their own, especially since their goals were very different from his. And what he does is he locks the hall where they usually meet to prevent them from meeting. But they figure, well, there's this tennis court next door. Maybe we can go meet there and take an oath that we will not break up till we have a new constitution. The French at this point do not have a constitution, they have a monarchy. And this is called the tennis court oath. And you have here, I don't know if you can tell, you've got, I think this is a member of all three of the estates. You've got the first estate there, you've got the second estate there, and you have the third estate. This is representative, symbolic of their banding together, because about half of more than half of the first estate, the clergy, are express solidarity with the third estate. And also some of the nobility go along with them as well. So this is really now allying themselves in defiance of the king in some ways. And they swear not to disband, once again, until they have a constitution. Now, the king is kind of nervous at this point, and what he does is start to muster the troops in Paris and around Versailles. And understandably, this makes people in town a little anxious, so they begin to arm themselves. And they wonder to themselves, well, we've got these sharp things. I wonder if we can get things that fire bullets. Where can we get things that fire bullets? And they realize that they can get them at the Bastille, what is known as the Bastille. And they storm the Bastille in July of '89. And some people really, this is, you might call it a watershed moment in the French Revolution. It's the first outbreak of real violence. Not a whole lot of deaths, but the Bastille represented something. It was not only the place that housed munitions for the city, it was also a prison, primarily what it was. And this is a quote from Lord Acton, who was kind of a near contemporary English writer. The Bastille not only overshadowed the capital, but it darkened the hearts of men, for it had been notorious for centuries as the instrument and the emblem of tyranny. What sort of tyranny? do you ask? Political prisoners were kept at the Bastille, effectively without trial, kind of at the whim of the monarch. So this represented monarchical tyranny. And after the Bastille was stormed, the people also called for its destruction. And here, at long last, we get some poetry. Where silent zephyrs sported with the dust of the Bastille, I sat in the open sun, and from the rubbish gathered up a stone and pocketed the relic in the guise of an enthusiast. So this is William Wordsworth. He's a young man of 21 years old coming on the scene. He's basically a foreign exchange student. He's basically a foreign exchange student. And what else do we know about him at this time? So first of all, again, he was 21 or so. And this is what he says of himself. Born in a poor district, it was my fortune scarcely to have seen, through the whole tenor of my school day time, the face of one who, whether boy or man, was vested with attention or respect through claims of wealth or blood. Add unto this subservience from the first to presences of God's mysterious power made manifest in nature's sovereignty, and fellowship with venerable books to sanction the proud workings of the soul and mountain liberty. So what is he saying here? He's saying that he grew up in rural England where people don't really care who you're descended from or how much money you have. Also, he's a believer. He believes in God. He has an admiration for nature, God's power revealed in nature. He's a reader, and also he is a, in the most literal sense, a liberal, right? Someone who is very much in favor of liberty. This term liberty is a key one, and it's really sweeping Europe at the time. It's a very important word and concept. It's basically the opposite of tyranny. It's basically the opposite of tyranny. What else do we know about William Wordsworth? This is from a poem of his, a different poem of his, not the Prelude. I traveled among unknown men in lands beyond the sea, nor England did I know till then what love I bore to thee. He loves England. He loves England. And this, we will see later, will become problematic. Now, he's just arrived in Paris. He has visited the ruins of the Bastille. Where's he at in his thinking on all this revolutionary stuff? Because he's not exactly contemporaneous with these things we're talking about. He's kind of coming around after the fact. He's there in 1792, which is a few years after the fact. So it's a slightly different situation. I've tried to kind of put in a single track, to put in parallel tracks, his story and the story of the French Revolution. I stick pretty much to the chronology of the French Revolution, but this is after the fact. Where is he in his thinking? He says, I stood mid those concussions, unconcerned, tranquil almost, and careless as a flower glassed in a greenhouse, or a parlor shrub that spreads its leaves in unmolested peace, while every bush and tree, the country through, is shaking to the roots. Indifference this, which may seem strange, but I was unprepared with needful knowledge, had abruptly passed into a theatre whose stage was filled and busy with an action far advanced. So what is he saying here? He is indifferent to what's going on. Why? Not because he doesn't care about liberty. In fact, he's made very clear that he's very much a fan of liberty, but because he lacks knowledge. He doesn't really know what's going on. He's in the midst of this really complicated situation, and he doesn't yet know enough about it to take a side. And we're going to see him as he takes a side. Night by night did I frequent the formal haunts of men, whom, in the city, privilege of birth sequestered from the rest, societies polished in arts and in punctilio versed, whence, and from deeper causes, all discourse of good and evil of the time was shunned with scrupulous care. So this here is a Parisian salon. It's basically where people would get together, the intelligentsia, the nobility. They would discuss literature, they would play music together. Sometimes they wouldn't typically discuss politics. That's, in fact, what he's talking about here. All discourse of good and evil of the time. They're not talking about the political events. They're not talking about the storming of the Bastille. They're not talking about any of the other things going on. And we'll see that for Wordsworth, this doesn't quite cut the mustard. These restrictions soon proved tedious, and I gradually withdrew into a noisier world, and thus ere long became a patriot, and my heart was all given to the people, and my love was theirs. This is really interesting. What does he call himself right here? A patriot. What is a patriot? Literally, it's someone who is very much in favor of his or her fatherland, literally, right? Now, France is not his fatherland. It's like the opposite of his fatherland. So he's using patriot here in a slightly different sense. That is, a patriot would have been someone who was in favor of often the people, or kind of freedom, liberty, fraternity, equality, these kinds of things. You would call yourself a patriot in England, and it has slightly different connotations than it might now. Now, this is kind of an important moment. He has changed crowds. He's now spending time with more common people. He doesn't say exactly who he's spending time with. The people, he calls them. But as we've seen, the third estate is very heterogeneous. All kinds of people in the third estate. You've got peasants up to really rich merchants. Merchants so rich they could even buy entry into the nobility. But either way, his sympathies have now inclined toward the people. A band of military officers then stationed in the city were the chief of my associates. Interesting. Some of these wore swords that had been seasoned in the wars, and all were men well born, the chivalry of France. In age and temper differing, they had yet one spirit ruling in each heart. Alike, save only one, hereafter to be named, were bent upon undoing what was done. These are royalists, royalist soldiers. They see the way things are going. They see that things look bad for the monarchy, and they don't like it. They want to reverse the course of time, if possible. They want to reverse some of the changes that are already taking place. They look very frowningly upon something like the storming of the Bastille. And this is what they might have looked like at a slightly later time. These are the kinds of people who later on became, the French pronunciation is probably something like émigrés, basically emigrants, people who left France because they were afraid of their lives, but also people who left France to muster support outside of the country to preserve the monarchy. And eventually they took part in wars. But anyway, this is the kind of person we're talking about here that he's hanging out with. Why is he hanging out with these people if his heart is with the people, the common people? I'm not quite sure. He doesn't say much more about it. Advocates like these, inflamed by passion, blind with prejudice, and stung with injury, at this riper day were impotent to make my hopes put on the shape of theirs, my understanding bend in honor to their honor. Zeal, which yet had slumbered, now in opposition burst forth like a polar summer. So what's he saying here? He was indifferent, really, up until now, as far as these political causes went. In fact, even though his heart is with the people, he's still hanging out with these royalist officers. He doesn't have any sort of real political passion or orientation at this point, until he comes face to face with opposition. This is sort of like when you meet someone who holds a certain view and you just don't like the person personally, you might think less of that view that the person holds. This is something similar, I think. Opposition burst forth like a polar summer. I think the picture is one of a glacier melting in the summer, and the sea level rising, and floods taking place. So this is another critical moment in his, should we call it radicalization? We'll see. Among that band of officers was one, already hinted at, of other mold, a patriot, thence, that is for that reason, rejected by the rest. Oft in solitude with him did I discourse about the end of civil government and its wisest forms. So this is a guy named, I think it's Michel de Beaupuy, who was nobility, but who hung around these officers and who was a fan of the people. So I don't know how that happened, but he was, and Wordsworth is beginning to talk politics with him. And this is going to influence him further. He perished fighting in supreme command upon the borders of the unhappy Loire for liberty against deluded men, his fellow countrymen. Here at this point in the Prelude, Wordsworth poem, he has a sort of elegy for this fellow. And I feature it because it tells us a lot about the kind of person Wordsworth was, the kind of things that were important to him. This friend of his, this person who befriended him, he was just a foreign exchange student, if you remember, whose French wasn't really even that good. This person who had befriended him and who had also shared his values, liberty, later on died in effectively the civil wars in France. This is his elegy to him. But he's not dead yet, not in the story. Along that very Loire, this is a river in France, with festal mirth resounding at all hours, and innocent yet of civil slaughter, civil war, was our frequent walk. So they would walk along the Loire and they would talk politics and they would do other things. They would enjoy each other's company. And when the partner of those varied walks pointed upon occasion to the site of Romorentin, home of ancient kings, I don't know what language I was pronouncing there, imagination, potent to inflame at times with virtuous wrath and noble scorn, did also often mitigate the force of civic prejudice, the bigotry, so call it, of a youthful patriot's mind. And on these spots with many gleams I looked of chivalrous delight. So what's he saying? They're walking on the Loire and they see in the distance or maybe near at hand this palace. There are lots of palaces along these major rivers in France and Germany too. And he is captivated by it in a way. Imagination takes him to really the Middle Ages, to King Arthur and his knights, to all of these things. And he has a soft spot for all of this, in spite of what he calls civic prejudice, bigotry, he even calls it. And he distances himself from it by saying, it's a youthful patriot's mind. He's not talking about his youthful patriot's mind. He's putting some distance between him and those views. This is kind of interesting. We see, and I've tried to kind of replicate this here. We see two parts, two conflicting views of things in Wordsworth. He's conflicted already, even at this point. Now, abolition of feudalism, August 89. Why do I mention this? Because we just passed Romorentin. We just passed these palaces along the Loire. And on the night of, I think it's August 4th, 1989, in the assembly, the nobles spontaneously gave up their feudal privileges and exemptions. They said, we no longer want to be treated differently. We no longer want not to have to pay taxes. We no longer want to collect all of our rents from the people who are working our land. They did this spontaneously. Some of the clergy joined them in renouncing their privileges as well. And what this effectively did, this was codified later in law, was bring an end to the vestiges of feudalism. It granted equality under law to all French citizens. No one had privileges over the others, except the king, presumably. So this was a big deal. When to a convent in a meadow green, by a brookside we came, a roofless pile, and not by reverential touch of time dismantled, but by violence abrupt, in spite of those heart-bracing colloquies, in spite of real fervor, and of that less genuine and wrought up within myself, I could not but bewail a wrong so harsh. So same thing's going on here. Earlier he saw the feudal palace, the medieval sort of knights in shining armor kind of vision. Here he sees something symbolic of the first estate, the clergy, the religious order. And he sees this isn't exactly a picture of what he sees. It's a convent without a roof, not fallen in over the course of time, but by violence destroyed. And he laments this. Why was it by violence destroyed? Well, in July of 90, you had the civil constitution of the clergy. And what was this? Well, even prior to this, you had anti-clerical actions on the part of the revolutionists. They confiscated church lands in order to pay off their debts. If you remember, debts were still a problem. How they resolved this was they just seized the land that belonged to the church, which was significant, actually, disproportionately significant. And they liquidated it, they sold it, and then they used that money to pay off their debts. With the civil constitution of the clergy, which a lot of historians see as one of the major blunders of the revolutionaries, clergy became state employees. They became elected officials. They were elected by the state and they were paid by the state. They were basically loyal to the state. And clergy, as we'll see from the next picture here, have to take loyalty oaths in support of this constitution, and only about half did, and fewer even of the bishops did. The others became what were called refractory clerics, and they were legally prohibited from doing things like, for instance, celebrating mass. And later on, worse things happened to refractory clergy. Now, needless to say, the Pope condemns this action, will not subscribe to this. And this created a conflict that apparently, I don't know a whole lot about modern French culture, persists even to this day. There are still vestiges of this conflict that began during the French Revolution to be seen today in modern day France, church, state, all of that. Later on, there were more radical attempts to de-Christianize the country of France. One of them, you may be familiar with, was the institution of the revolutionary calendar. And that really did two kind of crazy things if you think about it. We date our calendar from basically the birth of Christ. They dated their calendar from the first year of the adoption of the revolutionary calendar, which was like, I think, 1793. So no longer are we seeing history with reference to Jesus Christ. Also, the calendar features weeks, 3 weeks, not 4 in a month, of 10 days. And you can imagine what this did for church attendance. No one could remember which day Sunday was any longer. So these two things, these were deliberate attempts to de-Christianize the country. There are all sorts of other things. If you're interested in it, look up de-Christianization of France during the French Revolution on Wikipedia or something like that. Okay, back to Wordsworth and his story. Meantime, day by day, the roads were crowded with the bravest youth of France. Yet at this very moment do tears start into mine eyes. I do not say I weep, I wept not then, but tears have dimmed my sight in memory of the farewells of that time. Even by these passing spectacles, my heart was oftentimes uplifted, and they seemed arguments sent from heaven to prove the cause good, pure, which no one could stand up against, who was not lost, abandoned, selfish, proud, mean, miserable, willfully depraved, hater perverse of equity and truth. What's he saying here? he saw these soldiers going off to war, partying with their loved ones. He saw the tenderness, he saw the self-sacrifice involved in this, and he was moved by it. And he, just in the same way as when you, if you personally dislike someone, you're going to think dimly of that person's views just naturally. If you personally like someone, you're going to be more inclined to think highly of that person's views. So how could these people be wrong? How could these people so tender-hearted, so sacrificial be in the wrong? That's effectively what he's saying. Anyone who would be against people like these couldn't be in the right. Now, what does all this have to do with why are young men on the march? It's the War of the First Coalition in April of 1792. Now, Austria and Prussia, long-standing enemies of France, had been threatening France for quite some time now. They're monarchies. Everywhere in Europe is really a monarchy. They don't want to see the monarchy go down, because if it does, then that's going to send a message to their people as well that maybe their monarchies should or at least could come down too. So they tell France that if something happens to Louis XVI, we're going to destroy Paris. Needless to say, the French did not respond very well to this, and they declare war on Austria and Prussia. And because Austria and Prussia have allies too, they get pulled into it, and you get what is called the coalition, the First Coalition, and you have France's war with them. And this was sort of a firebrand. This radicalized further the revolutionaries. If you can imagine, now we've got war with really the rest of Europe in some ways. To Paris I return, and ranged with ardor heretofore unfelt, the spacious city, and in progress past the prison where the unhappy monarch lay, associate with his children and his wife in bondage, and the palace lately stormed with roar of cannon by a furious host. Insurrection of 10th August, 1792. What went on here? Well, let me tell you about Louis XVI a little bit. The king had been in Versailles, as we know. That's where the king of France lived. But if you remember all these bread riots going on, there was a large group of women, actually, who marched on Versailles, thousands strong, demanding bread. They took it from the stores at Versailles. And then after that, they actually forced the king to come back to Paris, to leave Versailles, to move into an old palace called I think it's pronounced Tuileries. And this right here that we see is the work of angry revolutionaries, angry about the threats of these other countries, on the defensive, at war. They storm the Tuileries Palace in Paris. They kill many of the Swiss Guard. We can see some of the Swiss Guard here, line here. Those were the king's kind of personal guards. And there are probably even more revolutionaries who die in the process. The Swiss Guard is probably a little better trained. The king escapes, the king survives, and he flees to the assembly, the national or the legislative assembly. This is that governing body that came out of the Third Estate and the Estates General. And they protect him, but they're not so sympathetic to the monarchy, if you recall. And actually, they suspend his powers. They suspend the monarch's powers. They basically depose the king. And on 21st September 1792, the state, as if to stamp the final seal on her security, and to the world show what she was, a high and fearless soul, assumed the body and venerable name of a republic. So if you remember, the tennis court oath was that the assembly wouldn't break up until they had a constitution. That was going to be a constitutional monarchy. So we're going to keep the king. We're just going to have a constitution along with him. It's not going to be an absolute monarchy any longer. Here, they've cut ties with the king. We have a republic, which is having a constitution without a king, a constitutional non-monarchy. This was the abolition of the monarchy in September of 1792. Lamentable crimes, 'tis true, had gone before this hour, dire work of massacre, in which the senseless sword was prayed to as a judge. But these were past, earth free from them forever, as was thought, ephemeral monsters to be seen but once, things that could only show themselves and die. The September massacres, 1792. If you remember, one of the reasons for the storming of the Tuileries Palace was because these revolutionaries, they're on the defensive. They're threatened. Their country is in danger from all of these opposing forces. They're suspicious of counter-revolutionaries as well. Enemies without France, enemies within France. And what happens is a kind of mania takes over, and the revolutionaries execute/murder about 1,200 people in the jails, prisoners, most of them non-political prisoners, that is, prisoners not really suspected of counter-revolutionary activity. Many of them are women, many of them are children, 17% of them are priests. These were what are known as the September massacres. Next, and of course, Wordsworth had just talked about the ephemeral nature of these horrors. We have the execution of Louis XVI in January of 93. And we probably don't have to say a whole lot about this. They basically tried Louis XVI and found him guilty of being against the revolution, effectively. No matter if being for the revolution meant being against the monarchy and against himself, he was held accountable effectively for treason to the revolution. And they executed him, and you can see a guy holding his head. The guillotine there, of course, is the instrument. It was invented, I think, by a doctor at the time, and they were trying to think of an easy way to kill lots of people easily. That's basically what it was. How can we kill people really efficiently? This was the way they came up with the guillotine. Now, what was the international reaction to this? It was significant. In fact, Britain, which had up until now stayed out of the war, it was not a part of the coalition allied against France. They kicked out the French ambassador from England, and the France didn't like that. So they declare war on Britain in February of 1793. Now, if you remember, Wordsworth is from Britain, and he loves it. And this is a big deal. No shock given to my moral nature had I known, down to that very moment, neither lapse nor turn of sentiment that might be named a revolution, save at this one time. I put in bold here the word revolution because this is the only time he actually uses the word in the 3 books of the Prelude on the French Revolution. And it's not even in reference to the French Revolution. He's talking about a revolution going on inside of himself. All else was progress on the self-same path on which, with a diversity of pace, I had been traveling, this astride at once into another region. Before, he had been talking about how, he'd always been a patriot, he'd always been about liberty. It was natural that he would be in support of the French Revolution. That was all to the good. That was to be expected. But here, this is a revolutionary moment for him. This was all supposed to work out together. He was supposed to be able to support the revolution. He was supposed to be able to stick with his love for his homeland, his fatherland. But we have a problem. This threw me first out of the pale of love, soured and corrupted upwards to the source, my sentiments, was not, as hitherto, a swallowing up of lesser things in great, but change of them into their contraries. So before he'd been talking about, this love of liberty, this love for one's fellow man, really being a sort of higher form of, for instance, his love of nature, a swallowing up of lesser things in great. Here we have a reversal. This is not in line with what his experience has been. In France, the men who for their desperate ends had plucked up mercy by the roots were glad of this new enemy, Britain. Tyrants, strong before in wicked pleas, were strong as demons now, and thus on every side beset with foes, the goaded land waxed mad. The crimes of few spread into madness of the many. Blasts from hell came sanctified like airs from heaven. Once again, you have the contraries, right? Hell, things from hell looking like things from heaven. I put here in bold the use of tyrants, because interestingly, for all the talk of the tyranny of the old regime and the tyranny of the monarchy and the tyranny of the nobles, where does he use the word tyrants? It's in reference to the revolutionaries. It's in reference probably to the Jacobins or the Girondins. My French isn't any good. It's not to the usual suspects. So again, he's using the word tyrant carefully. He's using the word revolution carefully, not in reference to the things we'd expect. The terror. Here we have the three people kind of at the head of what is known as the terror. We were just talking about the goaded land waxing mad, right? And the blasts of hell. That's a reference to what is known as the terror. Now, who was in charge of the assembly at this time? A group of radicals, political radicals known as the Jacobins or the Jacobins. There are different ways of pronouncing it. I think they were radical Republicans, basically. They began as a political club, like a lot of these groups did. And they formed at about this time what was ironically known as the Committee of Public Safety. I think there were 12 to 15 members. These are three of them, the most illustrious or infamous members. We have Robespierre, we have Danton, and we have Marat. I think those are the ways you pronounce their names. And there were a couple innovations, a couple new laws set down by the Committee of Public Safety. The goal was to secure the revolution from the forces threatening it from within, the counter-revolution, and without, the foreign armies. And there were a couple laws that would help them to do this. We had the law of suspects, which basically meant that people suspected of conspiring against the revolution were guilty until proven innocent. You had to prove your innocence in order not to be executed or at least imprisoned. Later on, another law was implemented, and according to it, citizens were obligated to report suspects. So not reporting someone was actually illegal, and you could be reported yourself for not reporting someone. You can imagine the kind of atmosphere this created. Also, no witnesses were allowed for accused people. It was just you and your accuser, and you were defending yourself. And there were only two possible outcomes under what were called the tribunals, the revolutionary tribunals. It was acquittal, that is innocent, or death. Those were the two possibilities. Here's some of the language being used about this time. Robespierre, in a speech February 74, uses the word tyranny a lot. This terrible war waged by liberty against tyranny. Without, all the tyrants encircle you. Prussia, Britain. Within, all tyranny's friends conspire. The government of the revolution is liberty's despotism against tyranny. So the revolutionaries too use this very important term. Now, what was the terror exactly? We talked about it a little bit. It's basically mass executions. This is Wordsworth's description. Domestic carnage now filled the whole year with feast days. Old men from the chimney nook, the maiden from the bosom of her love, the mother from the cradle of her babe, the warrior from the field, all perished, all. Friends, enemies of all parties, ages, ranks, head after head, and never heads enough for those that bade them fall. These are some prisoners waiting for either quote unquote trial or execution. Estimates go that there were about 17,000 executed during the terror, and hundreds of thousands of people held. People who were sentenced to execution were marched, or rather rolled in these carts across the square to the guillotine, of course. And I think, what did I see that on average, how many executions were being done? It increased during a certain part of the terror from like 8 to 17 or something like that, and I think that's a week. Steady executions. It could have even have been a daily sort of thing. I can't remember. But 17,000 over the course of really just a year or two. Most melancholy at that time, O friend, were my day thoughts. My nights were miserable. Through months, through years, long after the last beat of those atrocities, the hour of sleep to me came rarely charged with natural gifts. Such ghastly visions had I of despair and tyranny and implements of death, and innocent victims sinking under fear, and momentary hope and worn out prayer. Once again, I've put in bold there the use of tyranny. And again, this is about the revolutionaries here and not the usual suspects. The O friend here being referred to is the Prelude, is also known as the poem to Coleridge. Coleridge was a friend of Wordsworth's, also one of the big English romantic writers, and we'll mention him once more a little bit later on. We're almost finished. Then suddenly the scene changed, and the unbroken dream entangled me in long orations, which I strove to plead before unjust tribunals, with a voice laboring, a brain confounded, and a sense, deathlike, of treacherous desertion, felt in the last place of refuge, my own soul. What is he saying here? Who are these tribunals? These are dreams, nightmares he's having many years after the fact. He said many years he would have these for. These are the revolutionary tribunals, the unjust ones that don't allow you witnesses or any other option but acquittal or death, that demand that you prove your innocence rather than being required to prove your guilt. But the thing to note here is that what's the judgment going to be? He feels this sense of treachery. Where does he feel it? In himself. He is in his nightmare standing trial under Robespierre or someone like him. That is he loyal to the revolution? And he feels that he's not. He feels that deep down inside of him, he is in rebellion against this. And it's less death that he's afraid of here than he is about this revolution inside of him in some ways. Oh friend, few happier moments have been mine than that which told the downfall of this tribe, so dreaded, so abhorred. July 94, we have what is called the Thermidorian reaction. Thermidor was one of the months of the new revolutionary calendar. And we have here, this person that you see up there is Robespierre, and he's trying to talk, but no one's listening. Maybe people have just had enough of the terror, of the deaths, of the executions, of the guillotine, of cleaning up all the blood from the market square. Whatever the cause, We have a reaction against the radical Jacobin leadership. And Robespierre himself is executed along with many of his followers. And if you look here, you've got some people who are not too displeased about the death of Robespierre. And Wordsworth himself, as we just saw, is glad. He's glad. From that time forth, authority in France put on a milder face. Terror had ceased, yet everything was wanting that might give courage to them who looked for good by light of rational experience. What's he saying here? He's saying things have gotten a little bit better since the terror. The Thermidorian reaction, it's for the better, but there's nothing that is really showing signs that this revolution is going in the right direction, not to someone judging from what he calls rational experience. And this is one of those moments in the Prelude where Wordsworth kind of creates some distance between himself in the present and himself at the time he's writing of, because he goes on to say how he actually did have courage and hope and all of these things. He didn't have the kind of rational experience he's talking about. In retrospect, he's seen things that he didn't see the first time around. There's another story that could be told about Wordsworth at this time. I've focused on one of the strands, just as I focused on one of the strands of the revolution. Now, become oppressors in their turn, Frenchmen had changed a war of self-defense for one of conquest, losing sight of all which they had struggled for. So if you remember, the France had declared war really against Prussia and Austria and Britain as a reaction to perceived threats. Not perceived threats, they were genuine threats. We're going to destroy Paris. Now they're taking the war with them. They are becoming aggressors. They are becoming conquerors. They're conquering in a different name than has ever been conquered in before. Freedom, liberty, equality, that sort of thing. But they're still conquering. And we're almost to the end of our presentation here. But let me show you some examples of their conquests. This is Cologne, which is in modern day Germany. It was a free state at the time, but they've raised here the revolutionary hat, basically. It's an emblem of the revolution. They have effectively occupied a neutral state in the name of the revolution, spreading the ideals of the revolution. A little bit later, they make their way to Switzerland. And Switzerland, we know, is a pretty neutral place. Even back then it was. And they've hoisted, yet again, a revolutionary symbol here, a tree. And this was, I think, 1798, is a little bit farther along. And this is the incident that I mentioned to you, Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, another English romantic poet. This was what pushed him over the edge with the revolution. The invasion of Switzerland in the name of spreading revolutionary ideals was too much for him. And at that point, his heart rebelled against the revolution. It took him a little bit longer, but he wasn't in France at the same time that Wordsworth was. Finally, to close and seal up all the gains of France, a pope is summoned in to crown an emperor. This, of course, is Napoleon, crowned emperor. He crowns himself at the last minute. He takes the crown from the Pope and puts it on his own head. But much later as this was, 1804, Wordsworth sees this as really part and parcel of what ended up happening during the revolution itself. Napoleon wasn't just a freak of nature. He was in some ways a logical extension of the terror. So, thus, O friend, through times of honor and through times of shame descending, have I faithfully retraced the perturbations of a youthful mind under a long-lived storm of great events.